What's up, gear mortals? Trey Xavier here. Welcome to the ultimate compact modeler shootout. We have no fewer than 11 of the world's finest and tiniest amp and effects modelers to shoot out today. The modelers we're going to be looking at today are the Helix LT, the Boss GT1000, the Fractal AX8, the iRig Stomp IO, the Headrush Gigboard, the Bluguitar Amp1, the Atomic Amplifier 6, the Mooer GE 200, the Mooer Preamp Live, the HX Stomp, the Atomic Amplifier Box, and the Mystery Box, the contents of which will be revealed at the end. Because there's no way that I could possibly demo every single sound from each one of these 11 units, I've narrowed it down to 4 basic sounds that I'm going to demo for each one. A super heavy boosted metal rhythm guitar tone, a super high gain lead tone, a sort of mid-gain classic rock style crunch, and a very clean tone.
In the interest of fairness, and because most of the time the stock cabs in these things aren't all that great, or at the very least are going to be very different from each other, I've turned them off for all of these examples, and what you're hearing is each type of sound through the same cab IRs for consistency.
Without any further ado, let's hear all of these compact modelers in a mix and soloed, and then I'm going to talk about each one a little bit.
heard them in a mix, it's time to hear each one by itself. Here's a size comparison of each of the modelers so you can get an idea of which one is the right size for you. As you can see from this comparison, there's a lot of variety in size and form factor of each of these modelers, so it's important to consider which is the right size for your needs. And here they are all stacked up for a direct comparison.
The first one we're going to be taking a look at is the Helix LT from line 6. It's definitely the biggest one of the bunch. There is one bigger in the Helix floorboard family, and that's the full-on Helix, the original Helix floorboard. This one's a little bit smaller and about $400 cheaper, and it still has all the exact same sounds and effects as the full-size Helix. It's just a couple little features that are different. The Helix LT is a fully featured modeler. It's basically got everything that you could possibly imagine. It's got every feature of all the modelers. It's kind of enormous. It's funny because when I first got this, I was like, oh, cool. It's, you know, everything that you need all in one. And wow, it's so compact. And now compared to all these other ones that I've tried, it looks huge. Now it's got room for this expression pedal, so it has to be, you know, big enough to accommodate that. The volume knob, in case you were worried about not being able to see it on the fly, also quite large. It's got a full color LCD display that's huge. It's bigger than my cell phone, and I have a big cell phone. It's got the whole signal chain laid out right on the screen there. I don't have a whole lot of stuff on this one right now, but if for some reason you don't have access to a computer to use the HX Edit patch editing software, the editing of patches right on the interface is super easy. The sounds are really great. There's some that are a lot better than others, in my opinion. Some of them are a little hit or miss, but I found that there was no shortage of great sounds in here for me to use. Obviously, you heard that in the demo. One thing that this one has that none of the others do is Variax integration. So if you have a Variax, you need a Helix. You gotta do it. It's so cool to be able to plug your Variax in, change patches on the Variax through the Helix. If you have a Variax, you should not live without a Helix. You could do single button patch changes on both the Helix and your Variax. You don't have to mess with the pickup selector or anything. It's nothing short of incredible. Basically, if a modeler can do it, the Helix LT can do it. We've got a crap ton of I/O on the back here. We've got MIDI, we've got a digital XLR out, we've got the Variax in, a headphone out, stereo 1/4 inch out, stereo XLR out, two effects loops, and a jack for a second expression pedal should you decide that you need one, and USB to connect to the HX Edit software to save patches, to edit your patches. All in all, the Helix LT has a ton of stuff going for it. If it's maximum features and I/O you're after and you don't mind having a pretty big floorboard, the Helix LT might be the jam for you. Up next is the Boss GT1000. The Boss GT1000 is the flagship unit of the Boss modeling line, and it's the biggest of the bunch, of course, still quite a bit smaller than the Helix. It's got 10-foot switches on here, just 2 less than the Helix LT, and we've got the expression pedal again. Although I was eventually able to get a bunch of great sounds out of it and eventually find all the sounds that I needed in here, it literally took me 3 or 4 times as long as any of the other ones, and that's because the editing on the GT1000 is just unnecessarily convoluted and difficult. The biggest thing was just turning off the internal cab models. They really want you to use their cab modeling. They have something called the AIRD that has to do with matching the amps and the cabs together, which is cool, but I mean, I want to use the cabs that I want to use, and there's only 4 user cab slots for you to load in your own cabs, and you have to use a completely separate desktop app in order to get them in there. So I was really not impressed with that part of it. Once again, the sounds that are in there are really great. You heard them. It's just a little more difficult to access. Now, as a counterpoint to that, it has Bluetooth, and you can edit the sounds using an app on your phone, which I'm going to demonstrate for you right now. First of all, watch how fast it pairs. Crazy fast. It's already connected. Boom, done. That's it. It's that fast. There's only one other modeler here that has a Bluetooth app, and that's the Preamp Live. Obviously, Boss, being owned by Roland, has access to a lot of resources, and they can have something like that. So that's cool. And then in the app, we've got the whole signal chain laid out, just like that, and it looks just like it does in the menu. The thing that I don't like about the editing in particular is that you don't get to lay out your own signal chain. All the effects are already laid out in the chain, and then you just turn them on or off. Personally, I'd rather just start with a blank slate and drop in just the things that I want to use. And I feel like that would probably be a lot more processor friendly too. Although that's a great sign that it's got plenty of processing power to spare. There's just so much stuff in here. It's a little too much if you look at it. The whole signal chain, there's like 15 or 20 different slots on here, and they've all got something in it. So if you're opening it up for the first time and looking at it, it's a little overwhelming, to be honest. Another thing that I didn't really dig about it was the way that the amps are named. It's kind of impossible to know what kind of amp they're based on. For example, I was looking for just a typical 5150 for the rhythm tone, and none of them are called anything like that. Usually there's some kind of like parody name, like they switch the numbers around or change the name just a little bit so you still know what it's called. I wound up using something called X High Gain that did the same job, but I don't know what kind of amp that's based on. So when it's a modeling situation, I usually want to know what kind of amp it's modeled after, and this made it kind of hard. GT1000 has a full complement of I/O, just like the Helix. We have MIDI in and out. We've got a USB port for plugging into the computer. It's also got this amp control out, which is going to let you switch the channel on your amp using relay clicks. So that's something that I don't think any of these other ones have, actually. We've got 2 expression pedal jacks for a total of 3 possible expression pedals that you can have going on with this. That might be overkill for a lot of people, but you never know. We've got these XLR outputs that are marked sub-output for some reason, which was a little bit confusing for me while I was navigating the editing, but anyway, we've got it. 2 effects loops, send and return, headphone out, and main 1/4-inch output and the input. So fully featured, very powerful and complex, kind of to a fault, I would say. It's extremely powerful, but it's not as flexible as some of the other ones. Size-wise, it's the second largest of the bunch, depending on how you look at it. And it's got a lot going on, but I found it a little bit more difficult to access. So keep that in mind if you're looking at the GT1000. Up next, we have the Fractal Audio AX8. So the AX8 is the floorboard version of the Axe-Fx, which is, in my opinion, sort of the Rolls-Royce of the modeling world in terms of the quality of sounds. I had an Axe-Fx 2 for a long time. It is real sick. I think the sounds in there are the best modeled sounds I've ever heard. The attention to detail is ridiculous. The amount of stuff that you can tweak in these things is so far beyond what I would ever consider necessary. But of course, it just allows you to do basically whatever you want. You can tweak parameters in here that I didn't even know existed and I had never heard of before going in and being like, I don't know what to do with that, so I'm just going to leave it alone, is how I look at pretty much 80% of those. That just shows you how realistic the Fractal stuff is. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the features of the AX8 and see what we've got. The AX8 is only slightly smaller than the GT1000, but it doesn't have an expression pedal. It does have expression pedal jacks, but it does not have a built-in expression pedal, the first one of the bunch. It has one more foot switch than the GT1000, and one less than the Helix LT. The sheer variety of amp models in here is absurd, and they're all extremely well marked, so you can tell what they're supposed to be. I think it sounds incredible. You can load in tons and tons of cab IRs, and it's really easy to do. You can get a lot of patch editing done on the front panel. You can pretty much do anything. It's, I would say, harder than the Helix, but easier than the GT1000. It's not that intuitive, but it only takes a little bit of practice to get around and edit your patches. I bought the AX8 because I used to have an Axe-Fx 2. I also had a foot switch that went with it, and I decided that why wouldn't I just have everything inside the same unit? And it's got all the same sounds, slightly less processing power, so you can't use as many different effects at the same time. You can't use dual amp models like in the Axe-Fx 2, and you can't have more than one cab sim on at a time. So there are some limitations compared to the large one. You've also got a bit of a patch switching delay, so you're going to want to use snapshots instead. But overall, I still think it's the best sounding of the bunch. It's still kind of big compared to some of these other ones that we're going to get into. So very powerful, pretty big, no built-in expression pedal. Let's take a quick look at the I/O that we're working with. We've got a little bit less than some of the other ones. We've got MIDI, USB, a SPDIF out, which we haven't encountered yet. We've actually got 4 expression pedal jacks. That's crazy. That's even more than the GT1000 that had 2 and then a built-in expression pedal. You can have 4 total expression pedals if you want to go really nuts. We've got 2 loops, and then the main 1/4-inch outs and XLR outs, and then the in, and that's it. So certainly plenty for any typical situation. I've used this for about a year, and I've never had any problems with it at all. It's extremely powerful. I love the sounds, and I've used this one more than any of the rest of them, so it's a little bit unfair, but I do love this thing. It's kind of enormous compared to some of these other ones. It's not huge, but when I got this thing, I was like, sweet, it's so tiny. I definitely think this is a better sort of all-in-one travel rig than having a rack mount Axe effects and a separate foot switch, because you might as well have the whole thing in your foot switch, right? But it's still pretty big. This is definitely going to take up your carry-on. I also really like that, like the Helix, we have just a universal IEC cable as the jack instead of a proprietary power supply. So one of my biggest pet peeves with these modelers is that a lot of them have proprietary power supplies. And if you lose that on the road, you're pretty much screwed. If you have an AX8 or the Helix LT, you can just use a typical 3-prong power cable and you're back up and running again. So that's pretty awesome. Up next, we have the iRig Stomp I/O from IK Multimedia. So this is a complete interface for recording and live purposes. It's meant to be used either with your tablet or your phone, or you can plug it into your laptop as well. Really, the idea is that you're getting all the sounds from an app. You can use any amp modeling and effects modeling app that you have on your device, of course, to get the sound. It's just really integrated with Amplitude, which of course is made by IK Multimedia. So that's the one you're probably gonna have the most luck with. But I was also able to use it with Bias Effects, which I think sounds better than Amplitude. Amplitude is also pretty good, and they have tons and tons of amp models. So basically my general feelings about using a mobile device as your entire rig are pretty strongly negative, only because the reliability factor is really big for me. And just the idea of having to plug this little cable into here and hope that it's not going to pop out in the middle of your performance, or that you're going to get a call from your parents while you're trying to play and you forgot to put it on airplane mode, notifications you got to turn off, all that kind of stuff. So at a certain point, you might just want to have a dedicated device for this. And if you're doing that already, then like it kind of feels like maybe you're spending a lot more on this than you really want to be. I had some trouble keeping it connected to my phone while I was using it. That does not bode well for live performance. It has 4 foot switches, so you can set up 4 patches. That's cool. But I also feel like for not having any internal sounds at all, you could kind of just add a couple more buttons on there, if nothing else. So aside from the questionable reliability of such a connection that you're depending on, the unit itself is $300. And on top of that, you have to have a device to plug it into. So you probably already have a phone that you can use to plug it into, but that's your phone. You know, you need that for phone reasons. If you have something like an iPad that you're plugging into, that's another expense on top of that. It's starting to get into very expensive territory here. I think that you can get a ton of great sounds out of a mobile device these days, and it's actually kind of absurd. I was able to get really nasty sounds out of Bias Effects, and I was pretty happy with them. But at the same time, to me, that feels more like a backup or a last resort than having a really reliable #1 rig for what you're doing. It's not so much that it's bad, it's just that with all these other options, I feel like this is kind of a stretch. So the unit itself is very heavy duty, actually probably more heavy duty than I would need it to be for what it is. It has a really beefy expression pedal. It's extremely well made, very durable seeming. It's got these nice rubber grippy pads on the place where you put your device and on the expression pedal. It really feels very sturdy
which also means it's pretty heavy. So of course it's called the Stomp I/O, so I would imagine it's got some pretty good I/O going on. So the input jack on this is a combo jack, and the reason for that is that you can also use this for vocal processing, or really for anything that you've got. One of the major benefits of this is that you can use any kind of music app that's available on the market, and you can plug straight into it and use that. That's something that I didn't think of initially, but it's almost more useful if you're not a guitar player, actually. Maybe if you're like a keyboardist or a DJ or a singer, there's tons of apps out there that you can use in a live setting or for recording that you'll be able to tap into with this. We've also got a button for 48 volts so that you can use a condenser mic that needs power. We've got a headphone out. We've got stereo quarter-inch outputs, MIDI in and out, and then 2 external expression pedal jacks, as well as USB and a mobile jack for that's what we were using to get the sound out of our phone. So there you have it, the iRig Stomp I/O. So I didn't really think that this one was for me, but it's pretty cool that you can tap into all the different music apps that are available.
Up next, we have the Headrush Gigboard by 11 Rack and Alesis. This thing is still pretty new. There is a larger version of the Headrush that you may have seen. It's about the same size as the Helix. This was introduced this year, and it is much more wee. Smallest one that we've been looking at so far. I'm gonna go straight to my favorite part of the Headrush Gigboard, and that is this touchscreen. Holy bejesus, guys. Wow, look how freaking easy this is to use. It's touch, drag, drop. It's so easy. There's probably an editor for this that you can use on your computer, but I never even bothered because you could just, I love it so much. This is the most fun you'll ever have with a modeler. That is for damn sure. You can drag and drop stuff. You can delete it. It's incredibly intuitive. A child could do it. The screen is huge. Huge. It's full color. The actual stomp boxes themselves are very generic looking, and I feel like they could probably, for the quality of the screen that you're looking at, which is beautiful, it's bright, it's colorful, I feel like they could use some more detailed graphics on here of each of these things. But I'm also not a software developer, so I have no idea. But none of these other modelers have anything even close to this, and I think they all need to start thinking about upgrading to something like this, because it is just so great and easy to use. You know, I was excited about the GT1000 using Bluetooth and the app to edit on your phone, because you can do that in the middle of a gig or right before a gig if you have to change something that's really important, whatever. This, you could literally just lean over and beep, boop, 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 with the touchscreen, just change whatever you need to change, and you're done. Super great. Really easy to use. Absolutely love it. Now, that being said, I think the Headrush still has a bit of a ways to go. The amp models in here are a bit limited, and like the GT1000, they sort of suffer from a sort of generic naming system. It's a little hard to tell exactly what they're supposed to be. Now, these are not the same 11 rack amp models that you're used to, but they are the same amps. From what I was told by the company, they've been remodeled from the ground up, but they are sort of the same amps. So there's nothing really new except the modeling technology that's in there from the old 11 rack, and of course, just this amazing interface. Like the iRig Stomp I/O, there are only 4 buttons on here. That's perfect for me. I need 4 patches live. I can get away with 3 just fine, but 4 is ideal. You can also have it set so it's patch 1 and 2 and then bank up and down, which is how it originally shipped. But with the most recent firmware update, it's laid out in a simpler way, 4 patches. That's how I like it, personally. We're starting to get into very compact territory here. This is about the size of a college textbook. It is not that heavy. It's not quite gonna fit in the front pouch of your gig bag, but it's definitely a lot smaller than the original Headrush. There's no expression pedal, but let's take a look at the I/O here. A little bit less than some of these other ones. We've got MIDI in and out. We've got a USB port. We've got 1 effects loop. There's an external amp out, so you can switch the amp channel with the relay click once again. We've got a headphone output, and then we've got 1/4-inch stereo outputs. No XLRs this time. We have 1 expression pedal input, and then 1 that says toe, which I guess is also part of the expression pedal. Something called an aux in. I guess this is an 1/8-inch input, so this is probably for like jamming along to tracks, and then our input. A proprietary 19-volt power supply that sort of annoyingly comes in 2 pieces. I mean, I'm not an electrical engineer, so keep that in mind. But I kind of feel like they could have built this into here and then just had like a typical power supply here. I really hate that this is 2 pieces. This could easily come apart in the middle of your show and shut down your whole rig. I don't really like that, but once again, I don't design these things, so I have no idea. I think a lot of the amp models in here sound really good, although I found the selection to be sort of limited, especially in the metal category. I was kind of shocked to discover that there is no 5150 in here. Obviously, for a metal dude, that's a little bit of a disappointment, but I was able to get a lot of really great sounds out of here. I think having XLR outs would really increase its usefulness for live performance in the same way that I said about the iRig Stomp IO. But I think in general, having XLR outs is a really good idea for this kind of stuff because it's really easy for you to get a live sound engineer to give you an XLR cable to plug straight in, because all they have to do is unplug from the mic that was in front of the cab from the band before and just stick it right in the back of your modeler. And that's really simple. Getting a 1/4 inch output, usually you need like a DI box or something like that. It's less ideal. One thing that's really cool about the Headrush is that you can use 2 amps and 2 cabs at the same time, which some of these other ones, for as powerful as they are, just won't do that. So that's a big up for the Headrush if that's something that you need. Up next, we've got a little bit of an outlier. It's the Amp 1 from Bluguitar. Now, the reason it's an outlier is that it's actually not a digital modeling amp, but it's just so cool that I had to get it in here, and I wanted to put it in front of you guys, and it sort of loosely fits in the category, so whatever. It's actually fully analog. It's a 100-watt amp, and it's got 4 channels, 3 foot switches, and it sounds pretty awesome. The only onboard effect it has is reverb and a boost, if you can really consider that an effect. Kind of, sort of. But you could show up to the gig and plug this into a cab, and you're good to go. It's got pretty much everything you would need for most typical guitar players' needs. It's got 4 channels: modern, classic, vintage, and clean. You can only switch between 2 at a time. So for instance, whichever your overdrive channel is, modern, classic, or vintage, you choose that with this rotary switch, and then you switch between that one and the clean channel. This is the most recent iteration. It's got some additions since the last version. It's got just the typical amp layout with classic sort of Fender looking top hat knobs. It's got bass, middle, treble, reverb, master and gain for the overdrive channel, and then a volume for the clean tone, and then a master output volume. The 3 foot switches, one switches between the clean and overdrive channels, one gives you a boost, and then one just turns the reverb on and off. Pretty much what you see is what you get, kind of a situation. But if we flip it over onto the side here, we can see that there's a bunch of other little tiny micro knobs that we can use to change up the sound. We can set the level of the boost, we can set the volume and the tone of the boost for the modern channel and the classic channel, and then we can set the tone of the boost for the clean. We can change the effects loop to be serial or parallel, and we can set the noise gate to, no joke, it says metal, which probably means it's really fast and choppy, or a soft noise gate for pretty much everything else. That's pretty awesome and funny. As far as I/O goes, it's got something called the MIDI 1 remote input. There's a much larger foot switch that you can pair with this to change a lot of the internal options and everything. We've got a speaker output for 8 or 16 ohms. There's a recording direct output that's also a headphone jack. It's sort of got a cab sim type of thing on there. I didn't think it sounded that great personally. And then an effects loop and the input. So, like I said, not exactly quite in the same category, but definitely gets the same job done as any of these other ones. I also found that it sounded really great for everything except metal, and it sounded pretty good for metal. Not amazing, just pretty good. Any other style of rock, jazz, blues, that kind of stuff, I got 6 sounds out of this thing, and I was just so impressed with the sheer tininess of it compared to any other regular sized amp on the market, and the number of features that were in there that I just had to show you guys and get it into this shootout. So keep in mind that it's a little bit different, but definitely very awesome. Up next, we have the Atomic Amplifier 6. The Amplifier 6 is a 6-button version of the original amplifier, the OG, which used to have 3 buttons. So now we have twice as many accessible patches. I just love the form factor of this thing, first of all. It's got the most foot switches to size ratio of any of the ones that we've got here today. I really love the sounds that are in here. Despite the fact that I found that it sort of has fewer amp models than a lot of the ones in here, I liked a lot more of them more than some of these other ones. I like the Amplifier 6 a lot because it's sort of in the Goldilocks zone to a certain extent. The number of features to size ratio on this thing is outrageous. So it's got 6 foot switches, which means you can access 6 different presets on the fly. That's awesome. It's got a really simple interface. I wouldn't try to really deep edit anything on the face here, but you know, if you get to the show and there's just way too much bass, let's say, in your tone, there's just a bass knob right here, just like it's an amp, and you can just turn it down and hit save, and you've got less bass. So it's got stereo XLR outputs and MIDI, as well as an effects loop, which is nuts for something this size. It's got USB and a really great editor. It's kind of got the same problem as the GT1000, where they just have everything in the chain and then you have to just turn stuff on and off. You don't create your chain from scratch. But considering everything else that this thing has going for it, I'll let it slide. 2 expression pedal jacks, input, and then stereo 1/4-inch jack outputs, which also serve as a headphone out. Like I said, it sounds pretty nuts for how big it is. I really love this one, I'm not gonna lie. This is one of my favorite ones for sure. It's small enough that it'll fit in the front pouch of a typical gig bag. This could easily be your whole rig. Now we're starting to get real small. Up next we have the Mooer GE 200. So I first saw the GE 200 in action with my friend Andy Gillian from the band Mors Principium Est, who used this as his whole rig on their first ever North American tour. And I went to see them play, and it sounded amazing. Like, I've seen a lot of live shows, and I could hear his guitar clear as a bell. It sounded heavy and awesome, and I was blown away. So, of course, I had to get my hands on one. So I got Mooer to send one over, and man, is it just tiny, first of all. Teeny tiny, it's so thin. This has one of the craziest good form factors of any of the amp modelers we're gonna take a look at today. So it has some limitations in terms of like I/O and stuff, but it sounds better than almost all of the amp modelers that we have here today. I'm not even kidding. I don't know how they did it. It sounds great. It has most of the features as some of these other ones. The desktop editor is super easy to use. Simplicity is the name of the game with the GE 200. Some of the limitations that kind of bugged me, so far they don't have spillover with effects. So if you go from one patch to another, the effect will just cut off. That's pretty annoying. The foot switch layout, and this is something that I'm really hoping they're gonna update in a future firmware update, but right now it only works to go up and down patches, which means if you have 3 patches, like I usually do, 3 or 4 if I can get it, if you wanna go to the patch 3, you have to go up to it, and then if you wanna go from 3 to 1, you have to hit 2 buttons. I was really hoping that with 3 foot switches, you'd be able to have 1, 2, 3 patches just like that. They don't have that as an option yet. I'm bugging them about it though, because I really want this thing to do everything that I want it to do. And it has a little tiny built-in expression pedal. That's pretty awesome. Super easy editing, so easy. Look at this, you just, you know, you've got a button for each of the different effects in your chain, and you can just boop, 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 switch them like this. Super easy, really well designed. Absolutely love the form factor. So in terms of the I/O, it's a little bit lacking. It's bare bones, we'll say. We've got an in, stereo out, and an expression pedal jack for a second expression pedal if you need it. An aux in for jamming along to MP3s or whatever, headphone out, and a USB. So I think it's just plain too skinny for XLR outs. And, you know, obviously if this is what you're getting, you're going for convenience and size. So you know, having an XLR out would have been a nice luxury, but it just literally would have to be thicker. So that's not happening. I really, really love the GE 200. I think with a couple firmware updates, they could solve all these problems that I have with it and little annoyances. And I think this could absolutely crush. It's $300 and it sounds better than some of the more expensive ones that are on here. So I was very, very impressed with the GE 200. Up next, we have the Mooer Preamp Live. So this one is also a little bit of an outlier. It's slightly different from everything else we've got here. It's sort of meant to be integrated with an effects pedal setup that you already have. It doesn't have any built-in effects with the exception of a boost. The name is sort of a misnomer. It is a preamp, and it's a digital preamp modeler, but it also has a cab loader and power amp modeling. So this is a complete amp sound, and you can set up completely different amp sounds for each patch. There's 4 foot switches on here, and you can have 3 banks of 4 patches each. So kind of the idea here is that you have like effects pedals or a separate multi-effects unit, and then this has all of your amp sounds in it. Now, because it has MIDI, you can set it up to do all of your patch changing in the multi-effects, and it also has an effects loop, so you can put all your effects in the loop. And if you've got MIDI controllable effects, you can set all that up in here to do all the changing and everything. It also has this crazy feature called tone capture, which if you've ever used amp match on the Axe effects, it's pretty much the same thing. You pick an amp model that's close to the one that you're trying to emulate, and you sort of run it through that amp, and you sort of steal its soul a little bit. It applies the sound of that amp to the amps in here and gets it pretty close to the amp that you're trying to match. That's a pretty awesome feature on something that's only $400 as compared to like $2,200, $2,300 for the Axe effects. I love the simplicity of it. It's got 4 switches, but then you can engage the boost by just hitting that same button again. So you have the same patch, but just with a boost, and that works for every single preset. Taking a look at the I/O, we've got an input jack, send and return for a single effects loop. We've got a 1/4-inch output as well as XLR out, so that's awesome. And we've got MIDI in and out, headphones, and USB. The editor for this, once again, super simple, really easy to use, and I had no trouble at all getting the sounds that I needed. Had all the same sounds as the GE200 from what I could tell. Usually the included cab IRs in modelers are dog shit. I usually just wind up changing them all out for ones that I like, and I didn't have to do that with the Preamp Live. There was a cab sim in here that I loved, and I'm very picky about my cab IRs. So big ups to the Preamp Live. $400. It doesn't have any effects built in other than a boost, so keep that in mind. It's not like a full multi-effects modeler. It's really simple, super easy to use, sounds awesome. It's basically, think of it as just amp modeling and then bring your own effects. Up next, we have the Line 6 HX Stomp. This is the most excited I've ever been about a piece of gear, possibly ever. As a Helix user, both Helix Native and the Helix LT, I've gotten really used to the sounds in the Line 6 Helix family. I love them. I love the editing, the layout. I love the colorful screen, and I love the tons and tons of legacy effects that Line 6 has, like all the old effects sounds, all the new stuff. They're constantly updating the amp modeling, and I just love it. So when they came out with something that is this tiny, I almost shit a brick. I was like, I can't believe it. It's so small. As you can see, it almost fits in the display of the Helix LT. It's that small, and it has the exact same sounds. Personally, I can't think of anything that I would want more than this. Santa, please bring me this for Christmas. I already have one. It's sitting in front of me. I'm just kidding. The only drawbacks about the HX Stomp in comparison to the larger Helix family stuff is that you can use less effects. It's not quite as flexible, but it has the same exact amp sounds and the same effect sounds that you can get on that. You just use fewer of them in a single signal chain. And then of course we've got 3 foot switches total. I have them set up to just be, rhythm, lead, and clean. And this would 100% get me through a gig just fine. Here's the thing that I'm planning to do with the HX Stomp and why I was really excited about it. Because it has all the Helix sounds in it, I'm basically gonna use it like a sound bank, okay? I'm gonna load 3 of these into a rack for my band, set it all up via MIDI to switch automatically between patches during live shows, and never step on a thing ever again, and have the whole string section, bass and 2 guitars, have all our sounds in a single rack unit on a shelf and call it good. That's pretty amazing to me. Just talk about compact. Even if you're not gonna use as complex of a setup as that, once again, this could be your whole rig, and not only is this gonna fit in the front pouch of your gig bag, you could fit a power amp and all your cables and everything else. It's not gonna take up the whole thing. I'm afraid that if I sneeze, it's gonna blow away. It's so tiny. It's so tiny, but it still has a full color screen, plenty of I/O. It's got MIDI, it's got a headphone out, it's got an effects loop, it's got stereo outs, and an expression pedal in as well as USB. Stick a fork in me, I am done. This thing's amazing. It sounds exactly the same as the Helix, big enough to practically fit in my front pocket, and it's got this awesome like galaxy black finish. I friggin' love it, and I'm so happy that I have it. This one I think might be my favorite. I don't want to be too biased because a lot of these are crazy sick and I love a lot of them. This one, I don't know if I'm just super hyped on it right now, but I love it. I love it. I think it might be my favorite right now. Up next, we have the teeny tiny atomic Amplifier Box. This is another one that I was so stoked to get, and this is the smallest one ever. This is it. This is the smallest fully featured amp modeler that you can buy. It's definitely very limited, but if nothing else, this is the ultimate amp backup rig. If your shit goes down, this is the one that you want to have in your back pocket. It's got sort of a WYSIWYG, if you are familiar with the term. What you see is what you get interface. This is basically just like an amp. Now you can have patches. You can have 2 presets and you can switch between them with this. But the stuff that your amp sounds like is still set up using these. These don't save. If you've got your mids cranked up on one patch, you've got it cranked up on both patches. In the same sense that the HX Stomp has all the same sounds as the larger cousin, the Helix, the Amplifier Box has all the same sounds as the Amplifier 6 and the Amplifier 12. But it's just limited in how many effects you can have going. Basically, it has compressor, reverb and delay, and overdrive, fuzz, distortion pedals, that kind of thing in there that you can use. And you can save those within your signal chain, and then you can use this. You can actually use this boost foot switch to turn a bunch of different things within the signal chain on and off. You can set that up with the editor on the computer, which is also super simple to use. Like I said, a little bit limited, but also very powerful, especially considering that this is the size of a double wide Stomp box. It's got super simple I/O, in, out, 1/4 inch, and XLR out. You can have the cab sound only going out the XLR or the 1/4 inch or both with a simple switch on the front. You switch the amp channel and style with these other foot switches. So even if you don't have access to the editor via USB, you can just pretty much do everything on the front panel. And that's really awesome. Once again, just the ultimate backup. I think every guitar player should own one of these. If you're a gigging guitarist and your amp blows up, instead of saying, sorry, good night, just fire this bad boy up and go direct to front of house and keep the show going. It's possible that you'd already guessed it. This is the big reveal. It's the Bean. It's the Pod 2.0. This thing is 18 years old now. And the sound that you were hearing is the sound of just the amp modeling with the cabs turned off. So as you can tell, I'm sitting in 18 years of development of amp modeling, and we've come a long way, but actually the sounds in the pod aren't that bad. And really what sounded like shit were the cabs. So if you turn the cabs off on the Bean, it's actually not that bad. I was very impressed. I mean, you'll have to use your ears and decide, but I was shocked, to be honest. Having been a Line 6 user for a very long time, had the pod for a long time, had the Flextone 2 head back in the day, cab modeling was nowhere near where it is now. Using really good quality IRs will change your life when it comes to modeling. Using good cab IRs with the Bean was shockingly good. So 18 years old, it's still holding its own. It doesn't have any features. It doesn't have a foot switch built in, obviously. It's got a ton of amp models. Once again, very generic stuff. You can only have one effect on at a time, and there's only one knob for each effect. Nothing special, but it's the beginning. Know your roots. And it looks like a kidney bean. Super simple I/O, MIDI, stereo outputs, 1/4 inch, input jack, and headphone jack. So not bad for coming out in the year 2000. Guys, thank you so much for watching. This video was a massive undertaking for us. We hoofed it all the way out here to YouTube Space LA to shoot, and by the time you watch this, we will have been editing for many, many long hours. So we really, really appreciate your support. If you want to see more videos like this in the future, please consider joining our Patreon cult like these fine individuals right here. And be sure to mash that subscribe button and hit the bell for more reviews and original content. And we'll see you real soon.